All right, everybody. Now that you have created your spout, the final step on finishing your coil pitcher is creating a handle and attaching that to the form. Before you do that, you want to make sure that the clay is fairly leather hard. If you have any imperfections on the surface, you want to make sure that you clean those up before you attach your handle, because the handle will get in the way and prevent you from being able to scrape and smooth the surface the way that you might want to while it's not there. If you have an open space while you're still working on the surface, you want to do that first, and then make sure that everything's finalized before you start making your actual handle. You're going to start with some clay, just like you do for every other coil, but keep in mind that this is going to be a coil that's going to be shaped a little bit more like a carrot. It's going to taper from one side to the other, thick to thin, and you have to roll this out on the table carefully, and you want to make sure that you try to eliminate any kind of wrinkle or any kind of line that might be created in your coil before you start rolling it out. So I'm just taking my time to kind of prep the clay before I start to really roll out onto the actual surface, and making sure that it's nice and smooth and no imperfections in the surface of the clay. Make sure you taper it as you go. Before you even roll it on the table, it should already start to look like a carrot, and then when you start to roll it out even more by hand, it's going to start to stretch and create that same tapered look throughout the entire coil. I'm just going to need a little more room, so I wanted to make sure every time that I roll things out, I'm going to wipe it down with a damp sponge so it sticks to my skin a little bit. If it starts to dry out, I want to do it again. And I'm just kind of working my way from one side to the other. Start on the thicker side and work your way down to the thinner side, and adjust your pressure as you go. You should try to make sure that you have a little more pressure on one side and then a little less on the thicker side. Now, if you want your handle to be flat, you want to make sure that you flatten it out a little bit with the palm of your hand, like you just saw, and then flip it over and smooth it out with some water on your damp sponge, and then with your finger. Do this a couple times to help prevent the coil handle from cracking when you try to bend it. So once you have it done, you want to kind of make it into, depending on the shape of your actual pitcher, you want to make it into something that we might say traditionally like a question mark or half of a heart shape. This is a good technique of being able to kind of try to plan out how big your handle should be on the side of your piece. So if you take your pitcher and look at it from the profile view, you can kind of lay it on top of your handle without touching it, and then use a guide with the needle tool and cut to the exact angle of your wall. So I'm just removing the clay I don't need after I measured carefully the top part of that actual handle, and I'm going to be able to test to see if that's the proper spacing for my handle and proportion for my handle in relationship to my pitcher. Might be a little bit big still, so I can take my wire cutter and take another half of an inch off, or maybe an inch, depending on how much clay is coming off the surface there, away from the wall. I don't want it to be more than a couple inches away from the wall. If it's too far away, it's going to look awkward and it's not going to function very well. If it's too close, then you won't be able to get your hand inside the handle, and it won't work, and it won't be functional that way either. Now, I just lined it up directly across from my spout. Always, always, always make sure that you're looking from the back to the spout, and making sure that you find that center part of the wall so your handle will look like it's lined up directly across from your spout. And now I'm just kind of testing it out. Normally, you let the handle dry a little bit more before you attach it to the surface of your pitcher. You want to give it some time to actually stiffen up a little bit so that you can press the clay without ruining the shape of your handle onto the surface. So what I would normally do is let that handle dry for a little while before I started attaching it. But for the purposes of this demo, you guys are able to see what I'm doing with the scoring with a needle tool. This is the main thing that I want you guys to remember. Use the needle tool to score the surface of both your pitcher and the connections of your handle. Do a crisscross pattern, kind of a diagonal both directions, and make sure you hit all four parts, the two on the pitcher and the two on the handle, making sure that it's very, very well scored, or scored very well. Add a good amount of slip on both parts, and then carefully, don't crush your coil, carefully kind of wiggle it back and forth to make sure that the slip gets pushed into those cracks and going to help grab the clay properly so that the actual handle will not come apart once it starts to dry out and shrink. It might take a little bit of time to work this out. It's very important that you don't crush your handle and squeeze too tight right around the connection, because if you do that, you'll make a weak spot right where it needs to be the strongest. So what I'm doing is kind of carefully adjusting around that seam and making sure that the slip does push out around the edges, but I don't want to clean it up yet. I want to let that slip thicken up, dry out a little bit, and equal out with the rest of the actual pitcher. The handle will start to dry a little bit faster than the rest of the form, so you got to be careful, and you're going to actually have to wrap this up for a couple days or a day and a half and make sure that it equals out underneath a bag. Now, you saw me take a little bit of the clay off the bottom of my handle because it was unneeded clay, so I just used the side of my needle tool and just kind of lopped it off, and I will eventually start to adjust a little bit more of that once it's firmed up a little bit. So I don't want to press too hard, leave any major finger marks. That's the hardest thing about the handle. If you try to do it too soon, it could possibly be a little too soft and you leave a bunch of finger marks in your handle. You want to be touching it as the least amount as possible. Keep checking to make sure it's lined up with your spout, and then make sure that you wrap it up with the bag. All right, good luck.